Japs came in, these kamikazes with satchel charges, and all hell broke loose. There was firing, and pretty soon I heard a great big boom. We were all shooting. I was shooting out the window. The next morning, we went out and found this Jap all blown to hell and gone. They had hit the satchel charge. That was all that one night. We killed quite a few.
The Americal Division traces its roots to an infantry task force known as Task Force 6814. This task force was formed in mid-January 1942 under then Brigadier General Alexander Patch. On March 12, 1942, this task force was tasked with occupying the French colony of New Caledonia to prevent Japanese forces from seizing the island. It was on New Caledonia that Task Force 6814 was redesignated as the Americal Division. The Americal Division would later go on to fight on islands across the South Pacific before coming under the command of then Brigadier General William Howard Arnold in November of 1944. Under his leadership, the Americal would continue to fight in cleanup operations across the South Pacific before being assigned to Operation Victor II. Their key objective in this operation was the liberation of the Philippine Island of Cebu.
It was very combat experience. They had been to Guadalcanal to replace the Marines. They had been to Bougainville. After Guadalcanal, they had to go to Fiji for a while because of the malaria and everything else. But very combat ready, lots of experience. And as General MacArthur once said, what the Americal did is a very prime example of how light infantry can operate and be successful.
Starting with the invasion of Pyongyang by the 1st Marine Division in September 1944, the Japanese radically changed their tactics. Prior to that time, the Japanese would try to stop invasions at the water edge. The landing troops are coming, they had large forces on the beaches trying to throw the invading forces back. But because of the Americans' vast superior firepower in terms of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, and air support, they suffered crippling losses with these tactics. So at Pyongyang, they decided they would do something different. Instead of trying to defend the beaches themselves, they would go into highlands far beyond the beaches and draw the American forces in, which would get them away from some of the American superior firepower, and by digging in and having heavy fortifications, try to draw as many casualties upon the American invading forces they could.
The Japanese knew they could not hold Cebu City. They rapidly went up the Babag Ridge before we even landed in Cebu, and they prepared immense preparations. When we were there in 2015, we went into some of those caves that they dug. Great firing positions overlooking the coastal area. The Japanese would have lost too many soldiers trying to man beach defenses or even inland a little bit. Those large guns from the ships could reach inland quite a bit. And so what they decided to do is have a token resistance and just pull back through Cebu City and get up on Babag Ridge, where they held the advantage of the high ground. And there were some mines and booby traps on the beach and further inland, but not a lot, which tells me that they probably at the last minute decided that this is not going to work, and then they pulled back. Had they put more mines and booby traps on the beach and going inland, they would have taken a lot more American casualties, but they didn't. Once we landed on the beach and we moved inland a little bit, it was just a short jaunt to Cebu City. Inside of Cebu City, a number of the large government buildings were turned into torture places. One university we were at, there was a second floor balcony. We actually stepped out on there. We looked down at the students who were playing basketball at the time, and our guide said, well, during the war, they would take all the prisoners there on the ground, and the Japanese would say, okay, the following people are going to die tonight. They'd read off their names, and the rest of you we'll get to later. And when we got there, there was no Japanese were there. The Japanese had taken the mayor, all the city officials, and retreated up the Babag Ridge to prepare for the main fighting. The emplacements dug in well on Babag Ridge. The entree to Babag Ridge was through Gochan Hill, and that was manned by Japanese, but it didn't take us long to get past them. So Babag Ridge ran from north to south along the island, and so we were on the eastern side lined up, and then they were up there on the ridge. So we only had 2 regiments to attack Babag Ridge. And we did the very best we could. We had gunfire from the ships and everything else, but the ridge was just too long and we just didn't have enough troops. And General Arnold said, I can't do this without that 3rd Regiment. And what he did is the 2 regiments on there, the island, had the enemy fixed on Babrag Ridge. So he put the 164th Regiment down to the south, and they came around from behind and just swept right up on the ridge. And that's what drove the Japanese out. The fighting on Cebu continued on, and we took more control. We took over Babrag Ridge, and the Japanese up there on the ridge, what they did is they slaughtered all of the Filipinos that ran the city. They didn't take them with them, just killed them. And then they started moving north on the island. And at that point in time, we went after them. And that's when the Filipino division started to come together again, because we had the Japanese on the run. And so once we got up to the northern part, we knew that it's just a matter of time the Japanese would have to surrender. That's when the Filipino division really came into its own and started acting as a separate military force. And we helped them. If they needed help, we would send a battalion to help them. And they continued the pursuit of the Japanese further north, because they knew the island. Once the Japanese invaded Cebu, the 82nd Philippine Division basically became a guerrilla force. They weren't a division as such anymore. So they floated into the interlands and started guerrilla operations. What the Americal used them for, because they knew the island very well, they used them as scouts. They used them as security on the flanks to give us plenty of time to know if the Japanese were trying to flank us. The guerrillas on Cebu killed more Japanese than on the Big Island because they had very little place to run. Well, once we got up north, about 32 miles north of Cebu, which is more or less where the surrender would eventually take place, we knew we had the Japanese on the run. We had killed a lot of them. And it's an interesting anomaly. The intelligence reports said initially that there were about 4,000 to 5,000 Japanese on the island. And so General Arnold said, okay, we can handle that with our firepower and everything else. Well, as it turned out, on the main island in Manila and Luzon, the Japanese were losing badly. And so the only place that they could retreat to in short order was Cebu. And so they were coming on Cebu on the northern part of the island, not where we landed. And as it turned out, instead of 4,000 or 5,000, there were close to 10,000 or 11,000 Japanese on the island. And we never knew that. And yet we defeated them. We were told, you will be in the invasion of Japan. And if they lasted more than 3 days, they were going to get picked up. That's how bad they expected it to be.
After the bombs were dropped, the decision was made by the emperor for the surrender. That word had to get out to all of the Japanese units. They had not received anything that said that the Japanese had surrendered. So that's why those notifications were put out there. They didn't believe it, and then they were given a radio and they did the research and said, yep, Japan has surrendered. Arthur wanted the stage show of having the formal surrender of all Japanese forces on the Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But in Father's case, they said, look, we have the Japanese, about 20,000, who are surrendering. What do we do? And basically it came down and said, well, you can accept the surrender, but it's unofficial. It was official, but it's unofficial.
We said, send down your most trusted officers. And they sent down some lieutenants that were very highly trusted. The lieutenants were actually the aides to the commanding generals. So the commanding generals trusted them intimately, more so than let's go to a Japanese battalion and have the battalion commander go down. The location was chosen because of the geography, and it was also easy for us to send envoys to the Japanese and work things out. So it wasn't difficult for them to get down there when we were doing the surrender. So we had the soldiers there all lined up in uniform, loaded rifles, but we also had machine guns pre-placed that came in the dark of night and surrounded that surrender area with machine guns, just in case the Japanese wanted to do something. So they chose this one area, again, about 35 miles north of Cebu, close to the coast, as the most likely place to have it because they had a main road, main artery there, and the Japanese didn't have to go so far to come down and meet there on that facility. We had hundreds of trucks, military trucks that came up as well, because as soon as the Japanese surrendered, we took their arms, we searched them and everything else. They were loaded onto trucks and then drove down to Cebu City, and the boats were already there to put them on the boats and take them to Japan. And we had to have guards on those trucks because if the Filipinos got a hold of the Japanese, it would not have gone down well.
One of the generals, through an interpreter, he said, "I can get the rest of these people if you let me have my sword back, because we have no authority unless we have a sword." So I said, "Okay, give him his sword." He went back, and that's the way it worked.
On December 12, 1945, the Americal Division was officially deactivated after serving during the first 3 months of the United States occupation of Japan. However, this was not the end of their story. The Americal Division would go on to serve in the Panama Canal Zone before going on to fight in the Vietnam War. However, these stories are for another time.